Hello, everyone. This is going to be an episode where we're going to ask this question. Does the apostasy finding of the early church explain the eerie silence from many evangelists about Paul until near the Constantine era? Why was this true? We'll see. So, what findings am I talking about? These two records of the same findings, and these findings go back to the original church. Eusebius, bishop and early church historian, wrote in 325 AD in his famous ecclesiastical history 3.27 about the Ebionites. Now, the Ebionites, an Ebion is in Hebrew, it means a poor person, and the Ebionites were the name of the church at Jerusalem who called themselves the Ebion. And Jerome, who did the Latin Vulgate, in his commentary on the book of Galatians, points this out when Paul says, the 12 told me to remember the poor at Jerusalem. Jerome tells us that he is making a reference to the name of the church at Jerusalem, was known as the Ebion. So let's read what these men said. These men, the Ebionites, moreover, thought that it was necessary to reject all the epistles of the Apostle Paul, whom they called an apostate from the law, and they used only the so-called gospel according to the Hebrews by Apostle Matthew and made small account of the rest. But I've said before is they independently, we know from Irenaeus in the next quote in that whole context, they'll say they're okay with the book of Luke, but they don't accept the book of Acts. And so that Irenaeus is saying, hey, if you accept Luke's gospel, why don't you accept the book of Acts? So that's in this same context. But anyway, so uh, anyway, likewise in 180 AD, Irenaeus, bishop of Gaul, France, said about the Ebionites, those who are called Ebionites use the gospel according to Matthew only. That's the Hebrew version of it, the original, and repudiate the Apostle Paul, maintaining that he was an apostate from the law. We've had gone over what does the word apostate mean. It means you are saying God's law, which is supposedly, it says it's eternal for all generations, says so 11 times. Paul said it was temporary, schoolmaster. It was to fade away, and he was claiming this is all implied in God's word somewhere. He never cites anything for it. He just makes these claims. And so he is contradicting. He's doing exactly what the law of apostasy indicts you for. So if you say turn away from Mosaic law, it's been done away with, it was nailed to a tree, and all these different descriptions don't get away from the fact what you're doing is apostasy. And Paul was investigated in Acts 21 verse 21. If you look at it in the Greek interlinear, I said it again, interlinear, where Mountsy, if you look there, you'll see the word underneath it where it says, James is asking Paul, we've heard rumors, the 12 and I have heard rumors that you are guilty of, and it says in the standard English translations, forsake Moses. Well, the word is apostasy. Just go look underneath and you see the whole point. And so here's the finding of the church based on that initial investigation that begins in Acts 21, wasn't concluded apparently until sometime after the book of Acts closed. So that wouldn't be included there. And it likely would never be included there because that was not the purpose of the book of Acts. It was to get Paul acquitted in the trial in front of Nero, as we pointed out other places. Okay, so now what I'm going to say is, if this is from the original church, would you expect that there would be the best Christians would be the ones who would write books, write articles, but never mention the works of Paul? Because that would be the right way to obey this. Now I'm going to take a look at one particular figure first, Justin Martyr, and he is the very first evangelical Christian promoting through many, many books the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so he almost occupies the entire space of the earliest church from 100 AD onward. So what should we remember about Justin Martyr of Syria and then later in Rome? He lived from 100 AD to 165 AD. He was a great Christian evangelist and explained that many profess Christ but yet blaspheme God. As one scholar introduces this quote, we read, Justin brands Marcion and the Gnostics as heretics. It is not because they deny Christ. They do not. They confess the crucified Christ as their Lord and Christ, yet they blaspheme the creator of the universe, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The very identification mark of heresy is thus the blasphemy creatoris, the blasphemy of the creator. So just so you know, he's in an era when a movement has come into existence which only accepts Paul as an apostle and no other apostles, and it's called the Marcion movement. And so he's up against that. So you can see, why does that movement even emerge? And it's another thing. Why would a movement emerge that only follows Paul? And what is going to be the reaction of people like uh, Justin Martyr, particularly given the decrees we just read of the earliest church finding Paul was an apostate? Okay. Should we perhaps not be surprised that Justin Martyr is also regarded by some scholars as clearly having rejected Paul as on par with Jesus' words? Thus, when Justin Martyr wrote about blasphemy by those who claim to be Christians, Justin may very well have been thinking of Paul, just as we must ask ourselves if we truly love God. So let's take a look now. We're going to examine how often does Justin Martyr cite or quote Paul in his numerous works. All right, so here's the answer. Justin Martyr, one of the most prolific writers in the early church, whose writings have come down to us, and numerous writings. We're going to show you what those are in a minute. Yet Justin took no notice of Paul. That's in Encyclopedia Biblica. In Justin, quote, Paul is never quoted directly. That's in John Romanides' book, Justin Martyr and the Fourth Gospel, Greek Orthodox Theological Review, Volume 4 at 115. In canon, in the Encyclopedia Britannica, 1903, Volume 5 at page 8, and we have a link to that if you went to our webpage that has this. As it relates to Justin Martyr, says this, quote, Paul's epistles are never mentioned, although he doubtless knew them. Having little sympathy with Paulinism, he attaches his belief to the primitive apostles, and really it should say Jesus Christ. The epistle to the Hebrews and Acts he treated in the same way as the Pauline writings. So he ignored Hebrews and he ignored Acts. Now, by ignoring Acts, who is he obeying? I told you the Ebionites said you could look at Luke, but you cannot, you should not rely upon Acts. It's not meant for us. Don't read it. Incidentally, the Encyclopedia Britannica points out that as to other items of canon, it is pretty clear he relied on Matthew's Gospel's version in Hebrew that Jerome said was translated into Greek. Only the Greek version was canonized, meaning that's what we have today, not the original Hebrew version. The encyclopedia relates, quote, it is pretty certain that he relied upon an extra canonical gospel, perhaps the so-called Gospel to the Hebrews. The Apocalypse, John's Revelation, 1 Peter, and 1 John he esteemed highly. So this shows you the book of Revelation is in play early in the church, and this is the leading voice of evangelism. He's using the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. He's not disputing Luke, incidentally, and Luke's Gospel is, according scholars now realize in Edwards' book, the Hebrew Gospel and the Synoptic tradition. Great book. He shows that the evidence stacks up that Luke was translating the Hebrew Gospel. So if he's using Luke even here, you can't tell the difference because really it's going to sound the same as the same gospel that's called the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. So I want to add that there. And let's hold on. I'm going to take. Okay, so Isidor Frank in his Der Sinn Bildung, 1971, argues that the Memoirs of the Apostles, so that's what he keeps calling it. He doesn't say it's the Gospel of Matthew. He just calls it the Memoirs of the Apostles, are regarded by Justin and his community as auf einer Stufe with the Old Testament. That means they're on the same par with the Old Testament. According to Frank, Justin definitely includes the three synoptic Gospels within his designation of memoirs, but not John or Paul. That's interesting. Now, John is written in 97 AD, so that would be 3 years before Justin's born. So it may very well be that that book did not come to where he lived in Syria at this time. Now, interestingly, it's saying that he relied on the three synoptic gospels. That means to include he did refer to Luke's gospel somehow distinctly, and they know that. So that is, again, it's very consistent with what the Ebionites' ruling was. You can read Luke, can't read Acts. But it doesn't include John, so that's interesting, just a footnote to mention, but I don't think it's conclusive of anything. Justin represents a reversal of the trend in the second century church of regarding apostolic writings as canon. And by the way, this helps confirm what I've said before, that the book of Revelation comes in the 60s, around 67 AD, and the book of John comes 30 years later. And there was some misunderstanding of people, that some small minor reference in the some book. I think it was just Josephus's book about or somebody's book in the early church, they interpreted it to mean that John's gospel must have come before Book of Revelation, which is impossible. So Papias translated it, and he's doing that in the 90s, and he's much later in time. Translated is the wrong word. He is the amanuensis. He is taking dictation from John and writing down the Gospel of John. Another little point here. When Justin speaks of the apostles operating post-resurrection, just as clear, God sent 12, not 13, which means he implicitly ignores Paul. That's in Justin's First Apology, 49 to 47. The proof this may be deliberate is that Justin later in the same First Apology denies Christians believing, quote, predestination and fatal destiny. That's in book 54. And then he says, because the, quote, prophetic spirit instructed us in the doctrine of the free will by Moses, who introduced God speaking to man, behold, good and evil is before you, choose the good. First Apology, quoting Deuteronomy 30, verses 15 and 19. And notice we can see he's rejecting the doctrine of predestination, but he doesn't even name the person who's well known for it. And that's what I'm trying to say is the name of Paul is almost verboten. You can see there's something he doesn't want to ever mention the guy's name. And quite importantly, based upon Justin's many books, one may wonder if Paul's epistles were truly circulating among leaders of the church, as Justin clearly was. For Edwin Johnson in 1887 noted his, quote, Justin Martyr's silence about Paul when he had every reason to cite him in his anti-Judaistic reasonings is silence that speaks a void that no iteration of unattested statements, no nebulous declamations can ever fill. Edwin Johnson, Antigua Matter, A Study of Christian Origins, London, 1887 at 35. And I found that work, and it definitely says that. Papias, a disciple of Apostle John from 130 AD 2, never once quotes Paul. Now, Papias is the guy who is the amanuensis for John, and yet he doesn't quote Paul. That's a real sign, ladies and gentlemen, that John is obeying it, and he's taught Papias to obey this instruction of the apostasy of Paul is what's blocking them from talking about him. So have you ever heard this silence is going on? Ironically, most of all, the one person who should know about Paul's letters but appears to know nothing of them is Luke himself. Well, that's a whole nother issue. Why doesn't he know about them? I just want to digress into that for a minute. So another reason that can explain why there's such silence about Paul is his epistles are unknown yet. Although I think the apostasy ruling means they found some document that could establish it, but maybe the general epistles are not circulating. So listen to this. The fact Luke's Acts and Gospels show virtually no knowledge of Paul's epistles and say nothing in either to help their acceptance was first exposed by theologian F.C. Bauer. Recently, Hengel and Schwemmer in Paul Between Antioch and Damascus at 322 says, quote, since F.C. Bauer and his pupils, there has been no evidence that knowledge of Paul's letters by Luke can be demonstrated. Absolutely not. And if he knew about it, he was then misleading us. And I don't think Luke is a fabricator. And Hengel and Schwemmer say that no one made use of any of Paul's letters until after 100 AD, beginning with Clement. Now, that's a wrong date. Clement is writing at 67 AD, and he dies, and Paul dies then, and there's no mention of Paul. There's actually no quote of in First Clement or Second Clement. I've read them that mention any writings of Paul that he's reading or looking at. And the decree we're talking about was maybe not in place yet. So and we may have to know what the date is exactly of First Clement. It was clearly before 70 AD because he's talking about the sacrifices at the temple. All right. So and we'll get into other sources, and then now let me show you the writings of Justin Martyr. Here's the how they were summarized in Eusebius. So this is the list that Eusebius gives in his book. He's the historian of the church, right? So there were all these records or works. First Apology, Second Apology, Hortatory, Address to the Greeks, Sovereignty of God, Psalmist, On the Soul, Dialogue with Trypho. Well, there was a whole bunch more. And like out of the blue, in 1540, a single codex containing the complete works of Justin Martyr was discovered and purchased by Guillaume Pellissier. And so now, since then, the scholars have had access to many more works of his, and all these statements by Britannica and all the other sources are in contemplation of whatever has been recovered. There is no single quote or no single quote of Paul in all of these writings, that can't be an accident. It's systematically being done, and it is consistent with Justin Martyr obeying what the 12 said. It's also consistent with what they said. You should not read Acts for purposes of edification, but you can read the book of Luke. You see how this is all syncing up with what we've read about the Ebionites? He also wrote the Dialogue of Trypho on the resurrection and so on. So he has many, many writings. Nothing from Paul is in there. And I just want to show you another little detail here is that an expert went out and figured out all the times that Paul's writings appear in conjunction with the Bible texts, okay? And going through only about the, starting in the 4th century forward. So he's starting in, like, when it's 30, well, I got to figure it out, right? 301 to 399 is 4th century. He says 34% of the time, Paul's writings, the Gospels were typically kept apart from Paul's and the general letters of Luke. So this is a time period when it's the 300s, 4th century, is covering everything, including after Nicaea, and we're going to see the Nicene decrees of included at 325. No more Sabbath, no more Passover. We have to do worship on Sunday, and we can't celebrate Jesus' resurrection at Passover anymore. We have to celebrate it at the vernal equinox, which was the day of the goddess Easter, and that's where that comes from, and that's probably why Constantine picked the date, as he believed he was the son of that goddess. just so you know, he thought he was Sol Invictus. There's 2 statues up in Constantinople and Rome of him with his face in him, with him being depicted as Sol Invictus, and we have that in another video series. So what are we looking at? So after that, even after the time period that Constantine wants to hold on to Paul, because who is the only person who abrogates Sabbath in all of our writings? Paul. So now Paul is going to be resurrected when Constantine wants somebody to say, move your Sabbath rest now to Sunday. I don't want any more dispute over that. And that's what Constantine does, just as an offhand decision, by the way, at the Council of Nicaea that most people don't talk about. So, but the point is 34% of the time, the Gospels were typically kept apart from Paul and the general letters of Jude and James. So that's interesting, isn't it? And then 27% of the time, they were written in a separate copy containing no other New Testament writing. So almost call it 30% of the time, it's just Paul's writings all by themselves. Nobody else's writings connected to it 30% of the time. And this is in this general area where it's even in the time of Constantine when they want to promote Paul, as we'll see. So, and just something that you need to know is 85% of all Christian manuscripts that ever existed had a date from the 11th century forward. So a lot of people think there's this large amount of documents that we have all the way going back. No, we don't. We have very few documents earlier than 300. So when you have a treasure trove like Justin Martyr and he has 0 quotes of Paul, that tells you a lot. So we're now going to go a little deeper and give you some much more background. All right, now we're going to read a section from an author named Ernest Renan. He was from France. He was born in Paris, I think. He studied at seminary to enter Catholic orders. Then he studied at Saint-Sulpice to learn philology, including Hebrew. As he studied Hebrew, he began to go deeper into the subject matter. In the end, as his studies progressed, he chose a life not dependent on the church, so he could write freely. He became an instructor at Crusade Schools for Boys, Renan and Wikipedia. So he's now going to describe Paul, but just so you know, this is a biography of Paul that had been laudatory and effusively pro-Paul, and that's 300 pages of just saying all these nice things about Paul. And now he's coming to reality about the fact Paul is ignored after his death. And then he's going to come to reality. Well, we'll see. And then he goes to this. Even as regards the question of outward role, Paul was far from having the importance during his life that we attribute to him. His churches were either slightly substantial or denied him. The churches of Macedonia and Galatia, which are his own work, possessed little importance in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The churches of Corinth and Ephesus, which did not belong to him with so exclusive a title, pass over to his enemies, or are not deemed canonically enough established when only owing their existence to him. After his disappearance from the scene of apostolic struggles, we shall find him soon forgotten. His death was probably regarded by his enemies as the death of an agitator. The 2nd century scarcely speaks of him, and apparently endeavors to systematically blot out his memory. Please do not take that as an exaggeration by him. That's the fact. That's what Justin Martyr is doing. That's what Papias is doing. These are the leading voices of commentary, and they have zilch to give you of anything Paul said. His epistles are then slightly read and only regarded as authority by a rather slim group. His partisans themselves greatly weaken his pretensions. He leaves no celebrated disciples. Titus, Timothy, and so many others who, as it were, constituted his court, disappear without renown. The truth is, Paul was personally too energetic to form an original school. He always crushed his disciples. With him, they only filled the characters of secretaries, servants, and couriers. Yeah, I just want to mention, he breaks up with Barnabas and he breaks up with John Mark. I mean, so he doesn't get along with people, and that's what I think he's referring to. Their respect of their master was such that they never dared to teach freely. When Paul was with his band, he alone existed. All the others were annihilated or only lived through him. So basically saying he didn't try to create disciples. He tried to be the domineering force and just tell them, listen to me, listen to me, listen to me. And you're not teaching. You're just saying, listen to me, listen to me, listen to me. Next. In the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, Paul will increase wonderfully. He will become the teacher par excellence, the founder of Christian theology, the true president of those great Greek councils which make Jesus the keystone of a system of metaphysics is the Apostle Paul. But in the Middle Ages, especially in the Occident, his fortune will undergo a strange eclipse. Paul will say scarcely nothing to the heart of the barbarians. Outside of Rome, he will possess no legend. Latin Christendom will hardly pronounce his name, except that of his rival, St. Paul, his rival. St. Paul in the Middle Ages is in some degree lost in the glory of St. Peter. While St. Peter moves the world and makes everyone tremble and obey, the obscure St. Paul plays a secondary part in the great Christian poem, which fills the cathedrals and inspires the popular chants. So now what he's saying is he had this ascendancy in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries. He then basically goes out of attention again as the focus turns to Peter. And what he's going to basically say is that the real resurrection of Paul happens by the fact that Luther picks up on Paul and resurrects him out of the ashes again, a second resurrection, if you will, of Paul. Scarcely anyone before the 16th century is called by his name. He hardly appears in the emblematic monuments. So up to the 1500s, there's complete silence about Paul again. He has no devotees. They build him but few churches. They burn no tapers to him. His surroundings, Titus, Timothy, Phoebe, and Lydia, occupy but little place in the public worship, above all of the Latins. So nobody's remembering any of his friends. There's nothing to remember. There's no stories of these people. No legend to will it. In order to possess a legend, it is necessary to have spoken to the people, to have excited the imagination. Now, what does salvation through faith, justification through the blood of Christ say to the people? There was too little sympathy between Paul and the popular conscience, and probably he was also too well known to history in order that an aureola of fables should have formed itself around his head. Talk to me of Peter, who bends the heads of kings, shatters empires, walks up the asp and the basilisk, treads underfoot and lion and the dragon, and holds the keys of the heavens. So what he's saying is, yeah, Peter had a much more dramatic picture they could paint. So here's what he says. Let me just fix something there. Okay. I persist, therefore, in thinking that the part taken by Paul in the creation of Christianity should be ranked far below that of Jesus. According to my opinion, Paul should even occupy a position beneath Francis de Assisi and the author of the Imitation, both of whom saw Jesus in close proximity. The Son of God stands alone. To appear for a moment to reflect a soft and profound refulgence, to die very young is the life of a god. To struggle, dispute, and conquer is the life of a man. After having been for 3 centuries, thanks to Orthodox Protestantism, the Christian teacher par excellence, Paul sees in our day his reign drawing to a close. So he's saying this happened before, and we will now see another decline of Paul. I haven't seen it yet, Mr. Renan, but that's okay. At least you were saying that's what you think. Jesus, on the contrary, lives more than ever. It is no longer the epistle to the Romans, which is the resume of Christianity. It is the Sermon on the Mount. True Christianity, which will last forever, comes from the Gospels, not from the epistles of Paul. Well put. And I just want you to know, this is totally unexpected if you read any of the rest of the book. I think he's processed it and now is making a conclusion. about how he's going to assess Paul. You'll see. The writings of Paul have been a danger and a hidden rock, the cause of principal defects of Christian theology. I guess it didn't take that long to show you what he's come to the conclusion. Paul is the father of the subtle Augustine, of the unfruitful Thomas Aquinas, and the gloomy Calvinist, of the peevish Jansenist, of the fierce theology which damns and predestinates to damnation. Jesus is the father of all those who seek repose for their souls and dreams of the ideal. What makes Christianity live is the little that we know of the word and person of Jesus, the ideal man, the divine poet, the great artist, alone defy time and revolutions. They alone are seated at the right hand of God the Father forevermore. O humanity, thou art just at times and certain of thy judgment. So that ends his book. So he just suddenly at the end reverses course and tells you, I'm going to go with Jesus' words alone. And so there it is again. But I'm not trying to say anything about the JWO principle. I'm trying to say, look at what he's really telling you about Paul's acceptance. He went into oblivion until the Roman Empire decided it wants to get rid of the worship on Sunday of the Christians, and Paul is who's your go-to guy to get rid of the law, get rid of Passover, get rid of all these celebrations, change it to God's day of Easter. Fine, we will go along with you, the Christians are saying, because we have a guy who will say that we can do that. And so that's what Constantine learned, probably by having his son being tutored by a Christian. He learned something of our scriptures, and he found these writings, and he made them important. Okay, now we'll take a. Okay, and now if we go back, so we're talking about how important was Paul. Well, in his own lifetime, he complained about not getting letters of commendation from the 12 apostles. Also, in other contexts, it was clear Paul knew that he had no letters of recommendation from the Jerusalem church that sealed him as apostle. Thus, Paul claimed that the existence of the Corinthian church was itself the seal he needed, 1 Corinthians 9, verses 1 to 2, and that he thanked them for accepting him without letters of recommendation, 2 Corinthians 10, verses 9 to 18. So just so you know, Ambrose of Milan, the Bishop of Milan, said when looking at 1 Corinthians 9, 2, he makes a comment. He's doing a commentary on 1 Corinthians. And he says, this was at the time that the 12 apostles had determined that Paul was a false apostle, and due to some scandal they had with him. And he then, Ambrose, later in the same commentary, he says, I think it's a commentary on Galatians 2, verse 11, the same commentary on Paul's writings. And Ambrose the Aster is writing in the late 300s AD. And so he says that's when it happened. There was a scandal where Paul called out Peter and tried to humiliate Paul, and talk down and abrade Peter in front of other people to make a spectacle of people should not listen to what Peter has to say because he's a hypocrite. And all he was doing, we now know the other side of the coin. We've done a video on this where Peter, in the Clement recognitions and homilies, says, I was telling you, Paul, that we don't want to eat meat sacrificed to idols. It's too close to being in connection with demons. Anyway, let's digress from that. Let's get back to this. Eisenman recently cogently explains that these passages reveal Paul alluded that he did not receive, quote, official written letters of apostolic appointment from James, end of quote. That's from Robert Eisenman, the New Testament Code, 2006, at page 570. And see detailed summary of Eisenman's well-demonstrated discussion we present at this link. So we have a little link in this article on Paul. Thus, if Paul thought himself a true apostle in the capital A sense, Paul knew he did not have the recognition from the 12. All that they ever called Paul was a brother in Acts 15 and in 2 Peter 3. And then here's another thing. So Paul had had some success, it appears, at in Ephesus for a time. And well, what happened to him after he's dead, and now John steps in and is released out of Patmos into that area? Well, the scholars all agree that Paul was eclipsed by John's presence or activity. And I guess I don't want to read this whole thing. I'm just going to show you this. So F.F. Bruce did a book on this topic, and then David Blair summarizes it. And I'm just going to run to the chase. The actual title of the book or the article is The Pauline Foundation in Roman Asia is seen to be eclipsed, and the ongoing church there becomes a reflection of Johannine thought. So Paulinism is dead there. Johannine thought is there. And you think that's all faith alone again. No, we're showing you systematically that it's a completely different doctrine of salvation. then you've been led to believe in the way John has been translated. And just in brief, we're doing a series on going through each of the time pisto as appears in John's gospel, the 30 plus times. And the NIV Theological Dictionary said when the word pisto is used in reference to a person, it should be translated as obey. So instead of it saying, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whoever believe in him should have eternal life, it says all those who obey unto him should have eternal life. And that's repeated 30 different times. And in John 8, John denigrates those who just believe on Jesus in certain sense of facts on him, but do not want to become his disciple. They do not want to obey him. And Jesus says they have a conflict. And Jesus says, you now want to kill me that I'm asking you to be my disciple. And Jesus says when they're trying to kill him, just for him asking them to become disciples, he says, you're trying to kill me. You're sons of your father, the devil. So these were people who were Christians, believed in Jesus, and didn't then reject his invitation to be a disciple. They thought they could just just believe in facts about him and just move on. So that's John 8, and we never read it, so that's why we don't know about it. Then why did Paul ever come back? What brought any attention to him for a period of time? The reason was simple. The Roman state urgently sought to stop Sabbath resting practices. So Constantine was believing he was the god of the sun. That's why his statue in Rome on the Arch of Constantine had an image of himself on top, holding the reins, and it's portraying himself as Sol Invictus, which is a charioteer god. He rides chariots into the sky, and that's what he's depicted there, and his face is on there. And then the Constantinople, where the Nicene people are flowing in, well, right there was a statue of Constantine as god Apollo, which is the Greek name for the same god who's Sol Invictus in the Roman culture. And he's got the same face and the same pose and the holding a globe in one hand and all these other things. So he believes he's God, Sol Invictus. And of course, what we now know is when he died, he left behind what's called the commemoration coins. These were a series of coins minted, and he had obviously instructed them to say something very shocking. And it says his name is, what do you think his name is? God Constantine. So we have a whole series on those coins and all the coins that reflect on his true position, because those are like the only writings that you can actually say attribute to him, that these are things he authorized to be issued on his behalf. Anyway, so that's why he's rising. You need to get rid of Sabbath. And who's your golden boy? The guy who said, you can do that one day is special to one person, another person has another day. Just be convinced in your own mind what it is. And Constantine is saying in 325 at Nicaea, he says, just as one of the small minor things, just from now on, you're going to worship on Sunday, because the new principle is you're going to have nothing in common with Jews, no more Shabbat, only on Sunday, and you're going to not have any more Passover celebrations. You're going to only have it on the time of the vernal equinox of this goddess Easter. I happen to know her. She's my mom. I'm God Sol Invictus and Apollo. So I'm making a little fun of it, but did we not really know what he was up to? I hope we're not that dumb. Okay, anyway, now there is a time when the church had to actually use Paul's name and refer to his doctrines and analyze them, but not in a good way. Not a way of affirming him, but completely disaffirming him. And this is in Tertullian's book against Marcion. So this also shows you the brave. I mean, if Paul is a very popular figure, you can't imagine Tertullian would write a book like this, because what he does is he tears Paul apart and he destroys his validity as an apostle. And you're going to say, what? Tertullian was an Orthodox person. He was the leading voice of Latin Christianity. This is pre-Catholicism, by the way. And that's exactly right. He still had to destroy Paul, because this movement was of Marcion was to pull away Christians to a Paul-only church called the Marcionites, and they were becoming more popular than the Christian church. So Tertullian had to address this issue and be as blunt as he possibly could. So let's listen to what he had to say. We find the answer in Tertullian, a leading Orthodox figure in the early church, who said in 207 AD and against Marcion at 3.5 that, quote, Paul is the apostle of the heretics. Not a good name. That's not a good thing to be called. He clearly spoke disparagingly of him. Specifically, Tertullian in the verses Marcion at 3.5 said, Paul is the apostle of the heretics. In Latin, he called them heretoricum apostolus. One commentator, well-respected Hans Lietzmann, says this meant, quote, the writings of Paul, the heretoricum apostles of Tertullian, were regarded suspiciously at Rome. Okay, so somebody tried to dispute with me that it's not as negative. It is even, and he told me, go look up. This is what he said: go look up Hans Lietzmann, and he didn't even look at my article because I had already quoted this passage. Hans Lietzmann agrees with me. It's a negative. It's not a positive. So, in line with the fact Justin Martyr is ignoring him, in line with the fact Papias is ignoring Paul, in line with all of that, you have now, when the church is confronted by a Paul only movement, they have to answer it. And this is who they not hired, but spoke up. And basically, it's just very clear. Paul, what he says is, Marcion, you are a shipbuilder. You can't stow away on board something that doesn't have validity. And here it seems to me you've taken on board Paul. Well, there is no record that he is an apostle of Jesus Christ from Jesus, and there's no record other than his own words that he is an apostle of Jesus Christ. So you only have one witness. Therefore, you don't have proof. Therefore, we and no Christian should ever be attracted to leave Christianity to be in a Paul only movement who isn't even a true apostle of Jesus Christ. Could that not be more blunt, people? And people just blind themselves. I don't want to look at that. I don't want to see it. But it's true. And we can go through all that. I'm going to do, I think I got to do more on Marcion, because I think people don't understand what the church was up against. All right. And let me see what else we have here. Oh, and then one more. Now, David Burkott is a Protestant attorney. He's an Anabaptist, and I think he's an elder in an Anabaptist church. He wrote a book called Will the Real Heretics Please Stand Up, 1999. And this work he did is backed up by an exhaustive 705-page book called Dictionary of Early Christian Beliefs, 1998. I recommend both these books highly if you have money to do so. The dictionary is probably a little more expensive. The Real Heretics book is relatively cheap, I think. So Burkott says he admits he discovered that the early church, quote, in contradiction to many of my own theological views, end of quote, taught doctrines that universally, with no dissent, were rejected doctrines which we all recognize as part of Pauline teaching. I mean, yes, that's so important. The word universal is not an understatement. It's everywhere. Everywhere you look. Find me somebody who talks like Paul, other than Marcion, in this period, this golden period of 100 to about, put it to 250 AD. So this should have been Paul's shining moment if he was a real leader. And everybody says, oh, he was the founder of Christian theology. Well, he disappeared. So here's what Burkott says about total depravity. One other thing I want to mention is every time these quotes are, it's shocking that they're clearly referring to things Paul said, but never mention his name. And all these quotes. And it's not Burkott doing it. It's the original texts. The early church never taught that this is Burkott summary. The early church never taught that humans are incapable of doing or overcoming sin in their lives. They believe that we do have the ability to serve and obey God. That's at page 53 of his book, quoting, and he has a series of quotes of Origen, Clement, Lactantius. Quote, the early Christians didn't believe man is totally depraved and incapable of doing any good. Page 64. And by the way, Clement, unbelievable. It's absolutely the complete refutation of Paul without mentioning his name. And he's like, we're talking about 67 AD. Paul is only died a couple of years before. Next, Paul's doctrine of eternal security is contradicted. And this is Burkott again. The early Christians universally believed that works or obedience play an essential role in our salvation. And I think I need to emphasize it's universal. He is right. It's universal. You go read anything in that time period, it's universal. Page 57, he quotes Clement of Rome, Polycarp, the letter of Barnabas, Hermas, Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Hippolytus, Cyprian, and Lactantius. So again, I want to make a point here. He wrote a book, 705 pages. He did a dictionary of all their beliefs. So when he says absolutely universal, he means absolutely universal. How can that be if Paul is such an authority? He isn't. He's a nothing. He's a nobody at this point. So early Christians believed that a saved person could still end up being lost at page 65, and he quotes Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Cyprian. I would add quotes from Scorpion's Bite by Tertullian to the list. So there's a book I read myself, and he did not list it there. He had Tertullian in there, but not that book in particular. Hence, the early church rejected eternal security. Okay, now get this. Rejection of the grace alone doctrine of Paul. He says this, as surprising as all of this may be to you, what I'm about to tell you is even more bizarre. He's talking about Marcion, by the way. There was a religious group labeled as heretics by the early Christians who strongly disputed the church's stance on salvation and works. Instead, the heretics, taught man is totally depraved, they are saved solely by grace, that works play no role in salvation, and that we cannot lose our salvation once we obtain it. Burkhardt is discussing Marcion, who founded a Paulinist system of doctrine in 144 AD. Marcion said the 12 apostles were intended for a different dispensation, and that Jesus they present does not the Jesus that the 12 presents does not speak to us. Our only apostle to follow is supposedly Paul. Marcion was the first person to promote the doctrine of faith alone. As a result, the early church universally regarded him as heretic. Heretic, but the very doctrine that you and I are told is the normative belief we are supposed to have today. Burkhardt cites the works by Tertullian and Irenaeus against Marcion and the Gnostic heretics. For more on Marcion, see my book, These Words on Salvation, 2008, and Appendix B, How the Canon Was Formed. And this is the last one, and it's the most important and one close to my heart because we'll just leave it alone. Is Paul's doctrine of predestination was regarded as false. So it wasn't just untrue, it was false and dangerous. The early Christians were strong believers in free will, citations, and discussion. Originally, it was the pagan world, not the Christians, who believed in predestination. Also, the Pharisees were big into predestination, according to Josephus. Yet, in one of the strange quirks of history, Martin Luther took the side of the pagan Romans against the early Christians. It was once again some of the Gnostic teachers who taught that humans are arbitrarily predestined for salvation and punishment. Although not believing in predestination, the early Christians believed in God's sovereignty and in his ability to foresee the future. Well, of course. At page 70, 72, 73, 76, quoting Justin Martyr, Clement, Archelos, Methodius, and Origen. I pronounce it Origen, by the way, because in Greek, the G is usually a hard G, and while theoretically it could be different here, I don't like the alternative is you have to go Origen, and I don't believe that's how a Greek would have said it. So I refuse to bow to that. Somebody was telling me I pronounce it wrong. No, I'm deliberately pronouncing it Oregon. All right. So let's see here. I guess that's it. Now, okay, I think we're done. So that was it. That's the message for today. Is Paul was a nobody, literally not cited, not quoted, not discussed, and even when all these doctrines are refuted, which all are premised on Paul, these are all Paul's doctrines. Nobody mentions his name. It's as if he's supposed. It's almost like there's a code of silence. Let's not mention his name, but we'll talk about the topics. Same thing with what else? What I'm thinking of. Justin Martyr. He's talking on and on. He's not trying to dispute Paul at all. There's no need to because he's a nobody. Papias, he's giving doctrines too that are pro Christ, pro what Jesus taught. He was so big on what Christ taught. No need to even mention Paul. No need to distinguish his verses. What am I doing? I have to actually confront Paul and say, hey, guys, you're all looking in the wrong direction. Let's look over here to Jesus. And I'm trying to prove to you, don't follow Paul. But I have to deal with it. They didn't because he's not there. He's invisible. He's gone. He's forgotten. He's not even, they don't care about him. And it's not until the 300s that Trobisch starts mentioning, well, a third of the time, he's attached to the book of Acts and the epistles and all that. But that we're talking about probably post-Nicaea, after the time that Constantine took the reins of our church, and he needed to get rid of Passover. He needed to get rid of Sunday worship. He needed to get us away from any sense of the Mosaic law having any influence on our lives, because he wants to be what? Our king, our ruler, the Caesar in our lives, not Christ, not God Yahweh. And that was the battle that he was fighting and won, because only 5 people had courage to refuse his decree at Nicaea. All right, everybody. God bless. Take care. Ciao. Bye.